Hello, welcome to the Encontro do Medo channel. My name is Arlindo Chagas. Get ready for a journey into the darkness with these harrowing tales that mix suspense, drama and terror. Don't forget to like, subscribe and press the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. Dive into fear and tell us which story gave you the most chills in the comments below. Working as a gravedigger is a profession that many consider dark and lonely, but few know about the terrifying experiences that can occur in the cemetery. I'm going to tell you one of the stories I heard from an old gravedigger who worked for decades in a small rural cemetery. It was a cold, foggy night, perfect for stirring up the deepest fears. The gravedigger named Alberto was finishing closing a grave already quite late when he began to hear footsteps. At first he thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him, but the footsteps continued, slowly approaching. The cemetery was completely empty, so he decided to investigate. He walked to the center of the cemetery, and the footsteps seemed to follow him, but no one was there. Feeling a chill down his spine, Alberto decided to ignore the sounds and continue his work. However, the footsteps grew louder, as if someone was right behind him. He turned abruptly, but saw nothing but the tombstones and the dense fog. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him, and before he could react, a voice whispered in his ear, "You are in my place." The gravedigger ran off, leaving his tools behind. He never returned to the cemetery at night again. Alberto had always been a man of little faith, but that night made him question everything he knew. Determined to understand what had happened, he began researching the history of the cemetery and discovered something terrifying. In the late 19th century, a series of disappearances occurred in the village, and the bodies were never found. There were rumors that a local gravedigger had been possessed by a vengeful spirit and buried the victims in unmarked graves. Determined to find answers, Alberto returned to the cemetery the next night, this time armed with a strong lantern and a shovel. He began digging around the grave where he had heard the footsteps, looking for any signs of the missing bodies. The night was eerily silent, and the fog was even thicker than before. As he dug, the footsteps started again, this time faster and more insistent. Alberto felt sweat trickle down his forehead as he dug faster, trying to ignore the sound approaching him. With every strike of the shovel, the footsteps grew louder until he felt a cold hand touch his shoulder. He turned quickly, only to see a shadowy figure standing a few meters away. It was a tall man with an old-fashioned appearance, empty eyes, and an expression of hatred. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, with a voice that seemed to echo from another world. Alberto tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. The figure began to approach slowly, and terror gripped him. In a last effort, Alberto raised the shovel and tried to defend himself, but the figure passed through the blade as if it were smoke. Desperate, Alberto began to pray, something he hadn't done since he was a child. The figure paused for a moment, but then an agonizing scream echoed through the cemetery, and the ground around Alberto began to tremble. From the soil, skeletal hands emerged, pulling him down. Alberto fought with all his strength, but the earth slowly swallowed him. In the last moment before being completely buried alive, Alberto saw the shadowy figure disappear into the fog, and the footsteps ceased. He was found the next morning, unconscious beside an open grave, but alive. No one believed his story, but Alberto knew there was something darker in the cemetery than he could ever imagine. He left his job and moved far away, but his nights were still haunted by the footsteps and the figure he would never forget. One of the most experienced gravediggers at the cemetery, known for his courage, had an encounter that made him question everything he knew. This is the story of Eduardo, a seasoned gravedigger who faced a night that would change his life forever. One cold, starless night, Eduardo received an unusual request. A family insisted on a burial that had to be completed before dawn. They believed in an ancient ritual that required the body to be buried at midnight to ensure the soul's safe passage. Reluctantly, Eduardo agreed to the task and prepared himself for a long, eerie night. By 11 o'clock, he was in the cemetery, his tools and a lantern in hand. The cemetery was shrouded in a thick fog, and an unsettling silence hung in the air. As he began to dig, the rhythmic sound of the shovel breaking the soil was the only noise cutting through the stillness. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, he heard it, a soft, mournful wail coming from the grave beside him. At first, Eduardo tried to dismiss it as the wind. However, the sound grew louder and more distinct, resembling the cry of a child. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around, seeing nothing but the dense fog and tombstones. He resumed his work, hoping to finish quickly, but the wailing turned into a harrowing scream of agony. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold night. His hands trembled as he dug faster, the soil now feeling like it weighed a ton. Suddenly, he felt a bone-chilling touch on his ankle. Looking down, he saw a skeletal hand emerging from the ground, gripping him tightly. Panic surged through him, and he kicked at the hand, breaking free and stumbling backward. The scream intensified, echoing through the cemetery as more skeletal hands clawed their way out of the earth. Eduardo, now in sheer terror, grabbed his lantern and shovel, ready to defend himself. From the shadows, a figure slowly emerged, a gaunt, ghostly apparition of a woman, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Help us," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of suffering. Eduardo, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as the ghostly figure floated towards him. She extended a hand, and he felt an overwhelming sense of despair and coldness seep into his very soul. Gathering his last bit of courage, Eduardo swung the shovel through the apparition, but it passed through her as if she were made of mist. She continued to advance, her mournful eyes locked onto his. Desperate, Eduardo began to pray, his voice trembling as he recited words he hadn't spoken in years. The ghost paused, the skeletal hands retreating back into the earth. For a moment, there was silence. But then the ground beneath Eduardo began to quake violently. The graves around him burst open, and spectral figures emerged, their faces twisted in agony. They surrounded him, their whispers blending into a cacophony of torment and sorrow. Eduardo's lantern flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The cold was unbearable, and he felt himself being dragged down by invisible forces. As he fought to stay above ground, he saw the ghostly woman once more. This time she was smiling, a twisted expression of satisfaction and revenge. "You cannot escape," she hissed. "You must pay for their suffering." With a final desperate effort, Eduardo screamed for help, but his voice was swallowed by the night. He felt himself being pulled deeper into the earth, his vision blurring. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, the first light of dawn broke through the fog, and the ghostly figures vanished. Eduardo was found hours later, lying unconscious beside an open grave, his body covered in dirt and scratches. He never spoke of what happened that night, but he left his job and moved far away, haunted by the memories of that terrifying night. He could never forget the screams, the skeletal hands, and the ghostly woman who almost dragged him to his doom. The gravedigger João had always been a skeptic, dismissing stories of ghosts and supernatural occurrences as mere folklore. He worked in a cemetery known for its serene beauty and historical significance, but little did he know that his disbelief was about to be shattered by an encounter he could never explain. It was a chilly October evening when João was assigned a task that was both unusual and unsettling. The cemetery's old crypt, which had been left in disrepair for decades, needed urgent repairs. The crypt belonged to a wealthy family who had been buried there since the 1800s. João, equipped with only a lantern and his tools, reluctantly accepted the job, knowing it would be a long night. As darkness fell, João entered the crypt. The air inside was musty, filled with the smell of aged wood and damp stone. The crypt's walls were adorned with faded frescoes, depicting scenes of sorrow and angels, their features barely recognizable. João's lantern cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. João began his work, carefully removing debris and reinforcing the walls. The atmosphere was oppressive, and a sense of dread began to creep over him. His every movement seemed to echo through the empty chamber, amplifying the feeling of isolation. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Around midnight, as João was adjusting a support beam, he heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that he thought it might be the wind. He continued his work, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like a mournful lament, a voice filled with despair. João's heart began to race as he glanced around, seeing nothing but shadows and the crumbling stone. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a clearer, more desperate plea. "Leave now. Leave this place." João's lantern flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. He felt a chill run down his spine as he noticed a dark figure emerging from the shadows at the far end of the crypt. The figure was indistinct at first, a mere shadow against the wall, but as it moved closer, João could make out a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a gaunt face, wearing tattered clothes that looked centuries old. The figure's eyes locked onto João, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. João froze, unable to move or speak. The shadowy figure began to advance slowly, its form shifting and elongating with each step. João tried to reach for his tools, but his hands were trembling uncontrollably. The figure's presence seemed to distort the air around it, making it feel heavy and suffocating. Who are you?" João finally managed to stammer, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers elongated and twisted. As it drew nearer, João could see its face more clearly, a face twisted in eternal anguish, as if trapped in a state of perpetual suffering. "Help us," the figure whispered, its voice echoing with a mournful resonance. "We are trapped here, bound by the sins of the past." João, his fear mounting, stumbled backward, knocking over some of the debris. The figure's presence seemed to intensify, and João felt an icy grip around his heart. The whispers grew louder, blending into a chorus of tortured voices, pleading for release. Desperate to escape, João turned and ran towards the entrance of the crypt, but the air seemed to congeal, making each step feel like he was wading through thick mud. The shadows on the walls seemed to reach out for him, and the whispers grew into a cacophony of screams. Just as João reached the crypt's entrance, he felt a cold hand clutch his shoulder. He spun around, seeing the figure's hollow eyes mere inches from his face. In a final act of terror, João pulled away and bolted out of the crypt, his lantern flickering wildly as he stumbled over the uneven ground. He didn't stop running until he was outside, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. The crypt's entrance loomed behind him, dark and foreboding. The whispers had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. João never returned to the crypt, and the memory of that night haunted him for the rest of his life. He left his job at the cemetery, and the old crypt was sealed off and abandoned. The villagers spoke of a lingering presence in the crypt, a shadowy figure seeking release from its eternal torment. João's experience became a local legend, a chilling reminder of the dark secrets that lay hidden in the old cemetery's depths. To this day, no one dares to enter the crypt, and the whispers of the past are said to still echo in the stillness of the night. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. Dive into the fear and let us know which story gave you the most chills in the comments below.